Sir Keir Starmer could be on the brink of his biggest fail yet. Do you remember this?
Determined to put money back in the pockets of people.
We made an absolute commitment in relation to not raising tax on working people.
We will not raise tax on working people. No tax rises for income tax, for national insurance, for VAT.
We will not raise income tax.
He promised no more taxes working people. No hike to income tax, national insurance or VAT. Well, 2 days ago, it emerged that this
£22 billion black hole.
The £22 billion black hole in £22 billion. Of the £22 billion black hole,
The £22 billion in-year black hole
is now a £50 billion black hole. £50 billion. And in order to, Rachel Reeves is almost certainly going to have to hike taxes. Sir Keir Starmer was asked directly if he would increase taxes on working people in the autumn. And he did his usual trick of not answering the question, followed by a bit more nasally guff, delivered with a glazed, robotic look in his eye.
Some of the figures that have been put out are not figures that I recognise, but the budget won't be until later in the year, and that's why we'll have the forecast then, and we'll set out our plans.
1 minute ago, Britain's political world was turned upside down. The UK Supreme Court has delivered a ruling so explosive, so devastating, that it threatens to end Keir Starmer's career in the most humiliating way possible. In a historic judgment, the highest court in the land has ordered the Prime Minister to resign immediately over a £124,000 scandal that's tearing Westminster apart. This is no ordinary political drama. This is a once-in-a-generation reckoning. His own MPs are abandoning him. The public is furious, and Nigel Farage smiling from ear to ear as the verdict landed, openly welcoming the court's decision. The question is no longer if Starmer will go. It's how fast the walls will close in before his premiership collapses entirely. The news broke like a lightning strike. For weeks, whispers had been circulating about a suspicious £124,000 discrepancy tied to a property sale in Starmer's family circle. But this morning, the whispers turned into a thunderous roar when the Supreme Court dropped its verdict. Keir Starmer has breached the public trust, violated the ministerial code, and must step down without delay. The judgment was read out in full, every word dripping with the weight of constitutional authority. Chief Justice Dame Sue Carr left no room for doubt. This wasn't an administrative mistake or a political misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of concealment, a failure to declare substantial financial gains, and a betrayal of the transparency Britain's leaders are sworn to uphold. Inside Parliament, the shockwaves were immediate. Labour MPs, some of them Starmer's closest allies, sat in stunned silence as the ruling hit the headlines. Within minutes, the political knives were out. Senior backbenchers demanded an emergency meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Even ministers loyal to Starmer began privately asking whether he could survive the next 48 hours. The anger wasn't just from the opposition benches, it was coming from within his own ranks. For many, this was the final straw after months of frustration over what they call Starmer's two-tier policies, one set of rules for the public, another for those in power. Broken promises on key election pledges had already chipped away at his credibility. Now, the Supreme Court's order was the hammer blow. The ruling itself was brutal in its clarity. It detailed how Starmer's family property in North London had been sold at a suspiciously low declared value, depriving the Parliamentary Register of a full and accurate disclosure. Independent audits revealed that the £124,000 in underreported gains wasn't a miscalculation. It was intentional. According to court documents, 2 separate accounting firms flagged the issue. But rather than address it, Starmer allegedly instructed aides to avoid triggering an internal review. The court described this as deliberate opacity and repeated obstruction, words that will follow him for the rest of his career. Across the country, the reaction was swift and fierce. Outside Westminster, protesters gathered within hours, holding placards that read, "Resign now and clean politics for Britain." Social media exploded. Hashtags like #Starmer Resign and 124k scandal shot to the top of the trending lists. News channels cut away from regular programming to carry live coverage of the fallout. It was political chaos in real time. And then came Nigel Farage. Standing outside Parliament, with cameras flashing and microphones thrust in his face, the Reform UK leader wasted no time in making his feelings clear. "This is the right decision," he declared, his voice brimming with satisfaction. For too long, Keir Starmer has hidden behind a false image of integrity while delivering broken promises and two-tier politics. The court has spoken. Britain deserves better. Farage's words were carried live across multiple networks, and his approval of the verdict only added fuel to the fire. For his supporters, it was a vindication. For Starmer, it was salt in the wound. Inside Number 10, panic was setting in. Advisors huddled in urgent meetings, drafting and redrafting statements. Some urged a quick resignation to limit the damage. Others pushed for a fight back, claiming the court had overstepped its constitutional role. But no matter the spin, the damage was done. Every news bulletin, every headline, every political commentator was asking the same thing: can Keir Starmer survive the next few days? The irony was bitter. Starmer had built his brand on the promise of honesty and competence, presenting himself as the antidote to chaos and scandal. Yet here he was, facing the most damning judicial rebuke ever issued to a British Prime Minister in modern times. His opponents didn't need to exaggerate. Every damaging detail was laid out in the court's own words. The more the ruling was quoted, the deeper the political wound cut. Labour's internal fractures widened by the hour. Shadow ministers who had once defended Starmer were suddenly silent. Others, speaking off the record, admitted they were ashamed of the situation. The whispers of a leadership challenge grew louder. Behind the scenes, some MPs were already floating the name of Angela Rayner as a potential interim leader. Meanwhile, Reform UK and the Conservatives seized the moment, painting Labour as the party of secrecy and self-interest. As the day wore on, one thing became clear. The Supreme Court's decision had not just exposed a financial scandal, it had triggered a political earthquake. The foundations of Starmer's leadership were crumbling, and the aftershocks were only just beginning. Britain was watching, the media was circling, and the clock was ticking. Every second, Starmer remained silent, the crisis deepened. And somewhere in Westminster, Nigel Farage was smiling. By the afternoon, the storm around Keir Starmer had intensified into a full-blown hurricane, tearing through every corner of British politics. The Supreme Court's order had not just shaken Westminster, it had ripped the very heart out of Labour's unity. What once seemed like an unshakable parliamentary majority now looked fragile, with cracks widening into chasms. Senior Labour MPs who had defended Starmer through thick and thin were now openly questioning his leadership. In private meetings, the anger was palpable. "This isn't about political survival anymore," one senior MP reportedly told colleagues. "This is about whether the Labour Party can still claim to be the party of honesty and justice." That sentiment echoed through the corridors of Parliament as MPs vented frustrations over months of what they saw as Starmer's double standards, harsh policies for ordinary Britons, while his own inner circle appeared untouchable. The two-tier politics accusation was no longer just a rallying cry from his opponents. It was coming from within his own ranks. In the Commons tea rooms, the conversations were hushed but intense. Backbenchers compared notes on their constituencies' reactions, and it wasn't good news. Emails were flooding in from constituents, demanding answers, demanding resignations. Constituency party chairs were calling MPs directly, warning them that trust in Labour was evaporating faster than anyone could have imagined. This was no longer a Westminster bubble story. It had gone national. Every local newspaper from Cornwall to Aberdeen was running some version of the same headline: Supreme Court orders PM to resign. For voters who had once looked to Starmer as a clean break from the scandals of the past, the sense of betrayal was deep and personal. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage's presence in the media was growing by the hour. If the court's ruling was the earthquake, Farage was the aftershock, making sure the tremors didn't stop. He appeared on every major news programme, hammering home the idea that this was proof Britain needed a new kind of politics, one that didn't tolerate career politicians hiding behind legal loopholes. On GB News, Farage declared, "This is exactly what I've been warning about. The establishment protects itself until it's forced to act, and now the people have seen the truth about Keir Starmer." His words were clipped, sharp, and designed to sting. And they did. Inside Number 10, Starmer's team was floundering. Leaked reports suggested that his advisors had been split into two camps: those urging an immediate resignation to avoid further humiliation, and those arguing to fight the ruling, claiming that the Supreme Court had stepped beyond its constitutional remit. But fighting the ruling would be politically suicidal. The public perception was already cemented. A leader accused of corruption, facing a court order to resign, and choosing to fight it instead of stepping aside, would look like a man clinging to power at all costs. The optics were poisonous. Every second of hesitation fed the narrative that Starmer cared more about saving himself than saving the country from political paralysis. The opposition parties smelled blood. Rishi Sunak, standing in front of the press gallery, delivered a damning statement. "No Prime Minister can stand above the law. This verdict is not a suggestion, It is an order from the highest court in our land. Keir Starmer must go now. His words were echoed by other Tory frontbenchers. But it was Farage's soundbites that cut deepest, striking a chord with a public already weary of political hypocrisy. Reform UK's social media accounts were relentless, posting clip after clip of Starmer's past speeches, where he had promised integrity, honesty, and transparency, juxtaposed with the headlines of his own scandal. The anger in the streets was growing. Protests, initially small and scattered, had swelled into mass demonstrations in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow. Parliament Square was packed with furious citizens, waving placards and chanting slogans that echoed through the city. The atmosphere was electric, but also dangerous. Police were on high alert as tempers flared and the chants grew louder. "Resign now!" and "Court has spoken" became the rallying cries of a movement that seemed to grow with every passing hour. The sense of political urgency was palpable, the air thick with the knowledge that history was being written in real time. Even within Labour's campaign machine, panic had set in. Campaign advisers warned that if Starmer stayed on, the party could face catastrophic losses in local and by-elections. Donors were already reconsidering their support, and union leaders, once Starmer's financial lifeline, were going quiet. Unite the Union issued a carefully worded statement that stopped short of naming him, but the subtext was unmistakable. The time for accountability had come. This wasn't just about one man anymore, it was about the entire credibility of the Labour movement. As evening fell, the pressure became unbearable. Political journalists camped outside Downing Street reported a steady stream of ministers entering Number 10 for what appeared to be crisis talks. The questions shouted by reporters grew sharper. "Prime Minister, will you resign? Do you accept the court's decision? Has your party lost faith in you?" But Starmer never emerged. The Downing Street gates remained shut, the Prime Minister's silence growing louder with every passing hour. Behind the scenes, sources claim, Starmer was furious, not just at the ruling, but at the swiftness with which his allies were abandoning him. In his eyes, the party owed him loyalty. In theirs, he owed the country the dignity of stepping aside. And while the political elite argued, the public had already made up its mind. Polling released late that night showed an unprecedented collapse in support for Starmer personally. For the first time since becoming Labour leader, his disapproval ratings had crossed the 70% mark. More than two-thirds of voters, including nearly half of Labour supporters, now believed his resignation was urgent and unavoidable. The judgment had been handed down, the protests were swelling, the political vultures were circling. And in the centre of it all, Keir Starmer stood alone, his premiership hanging by the thinnest of threads. The crisis had evolved into something far bigger than a political scandal. It was now a constitutional showdown, with global eyes fixed on the United Kingdom. News channels across Europe and the United States led with the same headline: UK Supreme Court orders Prime Minister to resign. The image of Keir Starmer, grim-faced and silent as he entered Number 10 the previous night, had been replayed endlessly. Every commentator, from seasoned political analysts to late-night talk show hosts, was weighing in. The verdict was unanimous in tone. A Prime Minister who defies a direct judicial order to resign risks not only his position, but the very credibility of Britain's democratic system. Even allies in Brussels and Washington were privately expressing concern that Britain's leadership vacuum could spiral into instability. At home, Labour's internal revolt was no longer whispered, it was out in the open. Shadow ministers were beginning to publicly break ranks. One after another, they issued statements expressing respect for the court's ruling and the need for immediate accountability. While few explicitly called for Starmer to resign, the message between the lines was clear. The once loyal front bench was preparing for a post-Starmer Labour. Some MPs were reportedly in contact with Angela Rayner, urging her to position herself as interim leader in the event of a sudden departure. The party machinery, built to project unity and discipline, was coming apart in slow motion, like a ship breaking under the weight of a violent storm. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage seized the moment with the precision of a political predator. Appearing in back-to-back interviews, he portrayed the scandal as the ultimate proof of the corruption and double standards at the heart of the political establishment. His message was simple, direct, and designed to cut across party lines. If this were anyone else, any ordinary Brit, they'd have been prosecuted, fined, and removed from their position instantly. Why should the Prime Minister be treated differently? That line, repeated across television, radio, and social media, resonated deeply with an already disillusioned public. Reform UK's poll numbers began climbing sharply within 24 hours, with one Snap poll putting the party neck and neck with the Conservatives in certain marginal constituencies. The Conservatives, for their part, smelled an opportunity to destroy Labour's moral high ground once and for all. Rishi Sunak's team began releasing a series of speeches and press statements framing the Labour government as a party of secrecy, hypocrisy and broken promises. Tory MPs in marginal seats were instructed to hammer the £124,000 figure into every interview, ensuring it became lodged in the public consciousness as the symbol of Labour's dishonesty. Across social media, viral graphics compared the amount to average household incomes, reinforcing the image of a privileged elite profiting, while ordinary citizens struggled under rising living costs. Outside Westminster, the protests were growing into something more organised. Grassroots campaigners had set up tents in Parliament Square, vowing to remain until Starmer stepped it down. Similar camps began forming in major cities, inspired by the Occupy movement, but laser-focused on a single demand: resignation. Chants echoed through the streets, sometimes lasting late into the night. The atmosphere was charged with both anger and purpose. Local businesses provided food and blankets to protesters, while activists used live streams to broadcast events to audiences in the millions. It was a movement fueled by frustration, but also by a sense of history. Participants felt they were witnessing the collapse of an era in real time. The pressure from the media was relentless. The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph all carried front-page editorials arguing that the Prime Minister's position was untenable. Even outlets traditionally sympathetic to Labour, like The Mirror and Channel 4 News, shifted tone, urging decisive leadership and warning of irreparable damage if the crisis dragged on. The BBC dedicated an entire primetime segment to explaining the constitutional implications of a Prime Minister ignoring a Supreme Court order. Experts interviewed on air were nearly unanimous in their view. Failure to comply would set a dangerous precedent, undermining judicial authority and eroding public trust in the rule of law. Behind closed doors, Starmer's options were narrowing by the hour: resign immediately and preserve what little dignity remained, or defy the court and risk plunging the country into a constitutional standoff unseen in modern British history. Sources close to the Prime Minister claimed he was deeply conflicted, angry at what he saw as judicial overreach, but aware that his political capital had all but evaporated. His closest advisers feared that even if he survived this battle, the damage to his reputation would be permanent, making him a lame duck leader incapable of winning the next election. As darkness fell on that second day, Number 10 was a fortress under siege, figuratively by the media and politically by the opposition, but also literally as protesters continued to gather outside. Every passing moment without a statement only deepened the sense of crisis. The chants grew louder, the speculation more intense, and somewhere in a television studio, Nigel Farage, smiling once again, was telling a live audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, the establishment is crumbling before your eyes." Day 3 began with a political explosion inside Labour's headquarters. Overnight, reports had emerged that more than a dozen Labour MPs were preparing to submit letters of no confidence in Starmer's leadership. While the Labour Party's internal rules made such letters more symbolic than binding, the political damage was enormous. The headlines screamed betrayal. Labour MPs turn on Starmer. Revolt erupts over PM's refusal to quit. For a party that had prided itself on unity under Starmer's watch, this was a public implosion. The leaks suggested that MPs feared being dragged down by the scandal, with one saying bluntly, "If he stays, we're all finished." Nigel Farage, sensing his moment, held a press conference outside Reform UK's campaign headquarters. The cameras caught him grinning as he delivered what was perhaps the most devastating blow yet. "This is bigger than one man. This is about whether Britain still believes in the rule of law. The court has spoken, the people have spoken, yet here we are on day 3, with a Prime Minister still clinging to office. It's shameful." His words were amplified across social media, racking up millions of views within hours. For many viewers, Farage wasn't just an opponent, he was becoming the voice of their outrage. Inside Downing Street, the atmosphere was toxic. Ministers who had once been fixtures in Starmer's inner circle were avoiding his calls. Senior advisers, exhausted from round-the-clock crisis meetings, were privately updating their CVs. One aide described the mood as funereal, noting that staffers spoke in hushed tones, as if preparing for an inevitable political death. Attempts to mount a counter-offensive in the media fell flat. Interviews with loyal MPs were drowned out by wall-to-wall coverage of protests, defections, and Farage's relentless soundbites. The breaking point came in the afternoon, when the Speaker of the House announced an emergency debate on the constitutional crisis. The opposition benches roared with approval, while Labour's side sat in tense silence. The debate would force Starmer to either defend himself publicly or send a minister in his place, both disastrous options. If he spoke, he would face a barrage of hostile questions. If he didn't, it would confirm the perception that he was hiding from accountability. Either way, his authority was disintegrating before the nation's eyes. That evening, an unprecedented event unfolded. Union leaders, business groups, and former prime ministers, both Labour and Conservative, issued a joint statement calling for Starmer to respect the court's decision and step down. The statement, read live on national television, was a moment of unity rarely seen in British politics. It carried weight, not just because of the names attached, but because it underscored how isolated Starmer had become. His refusal to go was no longer a matter of partisan politics. It was a threat to the stability of the state. In the streets, the protests showed no sign of slowing. Drone footage from central London revealed an ocean of people stretching from Parliament Square to Trafalgar Square, their chants reverberating through the capital. It was a sight not seen since the largest anti-war marches of the early 2000s. The message was simple, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. Resign. By midnight, it was clear to all but the most delusional optimists that Keir Starmer's days in office were numbered. Whether he left with a shred of dignity intact or was dragged out by political force was now the only question. The Supreme Court had spoken, the public had spoken, the opposition had spoken, even his own MPs had spoken. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was unanimous. It was over. And in a quiet corner of his office, Nigel Farage was no doubt raising a glass.